Greetings, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming today. And I think all of you know me, but my name is Jennifer Bestie, and I hold the Koch Chair in Catholic Thought and Culture. And we're incredibly grateful to David and Barbara Koch for endowing the chair so that we could bring in speakers who could address issues related to Catholic thought and social issues. And John Pahl is going to be giving us a workshop on the common good. And I also just want to acknowledge that we need to be incredibly grateful. This wouldn't be possible without John Merkel. John Merkel brought John Pahl to give a lecture, an interfaith lecture yesterday on Fethullah Gulen, and it was phenomenal. And John graciously and generously agreed to change the date of his lecture, which was going to be tomorrow, to Monday night so that we could also do this common good workshop. And I never even dreamed of asking him to do that. But he had the idea. So, John, you're the
Because you have a conference to go to.
Yes, I do. I wouldn't have been here.
And you have to say why it's so important to you to be here.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to be here so much because John Pahl was my first theology professor. And I would be a wealthy, accomplished physician right now. Wherever I would want, and to give my children a lot. But because I had to have him my first year, freshman year.
Well, there's no way to burden her.
He's too talented for his own good. My parents were not exactly thrilled that I had such a talented theology professor when I said, I'm no longer going to medical school. I'm going to go to divinity school. That was the only time in my mother's life that she expressed severe disappointment. Because I said, Mom, I might get into Yale or Harvard. And she's like, but for theology.
Wow.
Yes, and that's, yeah. So anyways, but I am grateful to John. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. And, John Pahl earned his Ph.D. at the University of Chicago. He is a highly accomplished scholar, author of 7 books, including Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence, which is a phenomenal book on empire. Very, very, very relevant. Mm-hmm. And most recently, he spent 8 years writing a biography of Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World. And we are graced with the presence of Tolga, who is part of the Hizmet community in St. Paul. And it's just wonderful to have you. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
It's just, it's really a blessing to have you. And hopefully you can come back.
Yeah, inshallah.
You come a lot with John Merkel. So John, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm going to just have you start. Because if I just had him in my 2 Theo 100 classes, and I would have you introduce yourselves, but it would be too dangerous. Because all we did for the 80 minutes almost was the student would tell him something about him or herself. He would go on and on, making a theological significance out of anything they said. Like they broke a pinky, they had surgery, they, run track, and we would have a theological exposition of every single thing. So all of these people are absolutely amazing. And you're just going to have to trust me on that, right?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm delighted to be here, and I will ask you to introduce yourself. Very quickly, and I promise not to interrupt. So I met Dan already, who's in economics and theology.
I thought it was too dangerous.
Oh, I don't get you. You were probably prudent in that regard, given your recent experience.
I always have people introduce themselves for every single thing I do.
I'll also pass the book around. You'll notice this is my reading copy. When I do readings or talks somewhere, I just, it's all marked up. But anyway, there's that. And then I'll ask you to take a piece of paper as well. There will be a brief writing assignment at some point in the course of the workshop on the front and the back. I was going to use note cards, but I was told they were no longer an affordable enterprise. Or affordable
We've never had them in theology.
So anyway. It's great to be here, and let's start in this corner, and I'll keep my mouth shut while we go around the table, and maybe not all know each other.
Sure. Malik Stewart. I'm the Director of Multicultural Student Services at St. Anne's and St. John's, and I'm in my 8th year.
Great to meet you, Malik.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I did it.
I'm Ben Durheim. I teach theology here, mostly in liturgy and ethics.
Great to meet you, Ben.
I'm Sister Joyce Willenbring, and I'm a member of the monastery.
Nice to meet you guys.
I'm Joanna Padden, and I am Assistant Director of Campus Ministry here at St. Ben's.
Okay. I look forward to getting into the chapel perhaps tomorrow. I have a relative free day. And I can join you for that. When is chapel, by the way?
What?
When will be chapel tomorrow?
Oh, there's a noon service and a 5 p.m. mass.
Okay, very good.
I'm Aaron Both. I'm the interim director of campus ministry here at St. Ben's. So,
Nice to meet you, Aaron. Hi.
Hi, I'm Kathy Parker. I'm one of the librarians here.
Hi, Kathy.
John Merkel, Professor of Theology in J. Phillips Center.
Olga.
Tolga, I am not sure of the theology, so forgive me if I ask stupid things.
Great to have you with us, Olga. Thank you for your hospitality.
Deborah Pendleton, teaching global business leadership.
Great to meet you, Deborah.
You
Thank you.
just met many of your students. Sorry,
I said that to her. There was a whole corner of global business students who actually asked some interesting questions, said interesting things, so it was cool.
Hi, I'm Pam Bacon. I'm the Dean of the Faculty.
Nice to meet you, Pam. You have a great colleague and asset here.
And I'm aware.
Amazing work. I mean, it's really kind of exciting to see her research work.
Hi, I'm Chris Conway. I teach in the theology department in the School of Theology.
Hey, Chris. And back to Dan again. All right, so thank you all for being here today. I think there was a little blurb that went out about what we're going to talk about. I'm going to give a brief, 15 or so minute kind of overview, set in some context, some of this conversation that we'll have, and then I'll ask you to write, and we'll about a couple key studies. And the reason for the writing is simply to keep your comments brief so that we can get lots of voices into the conversation, because I hope and think you'll find the case studies illuminating and generative. So, redrawing lines in the post-truth era. So, here's our question for the day. Must we rethink relations between the classroom and public life, activism and understanding, religion, ceremony, and science in the quest for a vision of the common good upon which we can take concrete action? And the context for this, my thinking about it was informed by this article by Ann Applebaum, The Bad Guys Are Winning, in The Atlantic, How a New League of Autocrats is Outsmarting the West. Of course, since this was published, and I think it was, what does it say? December, yeah. I mean, things have gotten worse, right? We see the leading autocrat, in my humble estimation. I think it's the Putin model that is really replicated around the globe. Undertaking a clear war of aggression against the people of Ukraine, and it is, our prayers I know, are all shared for peace. But that's our question, okay? Sound good? Interesting? Let's go. My own commitments lie somewhere between the 8th commandment and historical objectivity. So I started doing research in the 8th commandment for Lutherans. We may number them as slightly different than you, as thou shalt not bear false witness. So I started the research on Fethullah in 2010, when things were booming for people of his net within Turkey. There's a reason Barack Obama made his first state visit to Turkey, because there was this robust civil society organization committed to education, building schools, math and science academies, to generating wealth to solve the problems of poverty and to commit wealth to the common good, and then engaging in interreligious dialogue across some of the starkest differences in Turkish culture, and that have grown into this global movement. So 2010, when I began it, and I just was wrapping up the research on Empire of Sacrifice, which was a difficult book to write, and then in 2012 it all fell apart. And you began to hear profound disinformation coming out of Turkey about Gülen and Hizmet, to the point where now anybody associated with Gülen and Hizmet has been labeled a terrorist. Right? I mean, it's truly a series of human rights violations within Turkey that very few people know about, and that cries out for justice. So as I was doing the research for this book, I increasingly moved away from traditional historical objectivity while remaining my distance, and interviewing both critics and advocates for Hizmet. But I found myself increasingly drawn to advocacy, simply because I felt compelled to speak the truth against the slanders being uttered against this man Gülen, right? I mean, the Eighth Amendment, thou shalt not bear false witness, also means that we don't put up with slander. We don't allow our neighbor to be vilified unjustly and unfairly. At least that's how Luther explained the commandment. So that's the sort of my own context for understanding this issue in terms of research, at least, is how do we negotiate in this post-truth era of profound disinformation, bald, big lies. I mean, propagandist big lies, right? In our own teaching and research as well. So, 4 musical macro-historical trajectories impacting our present. I'm an advocate of long history, or big history, as Steven Pinker calls it, and what I'm going to do is just kind of set in context for you some of how we got to this point. So, starting with 1. I really like this book. Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. Because he points out how since basically the 17th century and through the Enlightenment, humanity has experienced something that should call forth in us an ode to joy. Although it doesn't look real joyful in this particular image, does he? But anyway, Pinker's point is that we live in the most peaceful era of human history ever. Fewest interstate wars, right? Longest life expectancy, greatest creature comforts, lowest infant mortality rate, highest relative income. I mean, you know, the UN Millennium Goals were reached, you know, years before it was, they were supposed to. So what I call this, you know, ode to joy, or enlightened empires, globalizing science and industrial egalitarianism, 17th century to the present. Now, I say Pinker chastened because of recent events and the rise of all these autocracies, but also because, of course, this ode to joy was hardly shared across communities. There were some profound blind spots on the part of these empires and systems, right, that were ruthless and destructive, as empires tend to be. So, in any event, ode to joy, chastened, but enlightened empires, enlightenment empires, globalizing science, industrial egalitarianism, something along those lines. That's one of the long trajectories I see at work, leading to our present. Second, onward Christian soldiers. Fundamentalism as white Christian resistance to these globalizing egalitarian impulses. And if you understand the history of fundamentalism, which includes, by and large, many of the evangelical communities down to today, it is not the old-time religion. It is a backlash to modernity. And late 19th century Princeton is really where fundamentalism arose, and then funding from Standard Oil, right, led to the publication of the Fundamentals, which were sent out to every, at least 10 tracts, volumes that were sent out to every Protestant congregation in the United States. And Anthea Butler has recently published a book that I think is really worth checking out, White Evangelical Racism, in which her central argument is racism is not an incidental feature of evangelical Protestantism in the United States. It is at its very heart. And I'm willing to extend this even more broadly to white Christianity in the United States. That there is a substrate woven into the DNA of how Christianity has operated in relationship to the American nation, in relationship to the civil religion in the United States, that is simply woven into racism in the name of Jesus. So, second trajectory, long trajectory in our culture, leading us to our present. All right. Third, we shall overcome, which I describe as the social linguistic construction of everything. So I am a critic of the romanticizing of the civil rights movement, because I think it undermines or it caricatures the coalition building and the deep training and work that went on, and the non-violence, right, that was crucial to the civil rights movement as well. Which is why I talk about, what we are living with in many ways post-civil rights is now nihilism and spiritual garb. So from the mid-20th century, from deconstructionism to Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, Bill Maher, that whole crew of sort of the secular disdain for our religious traditions, the secular disparaging of our religious traditions in interest of what? Spirituality, perhaps, maybe. Anyway, that's a third long trajectory that I see, and this led us into the current polarization that we live with today, which is sort of win at all costs dynamics. Fourth, Mr. Backlash, Nina Simone, Backlash Blues. Anti-intellectualism, and this goes back to especially Richard Hofstadter's essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, and his collection of essays, Anti-Intellectualism in America. It's nothing new, in other words, but we see it in concentrated and distilled form in the present, the revolt against elites and the resurgence of religious nationalism, mid-20th century to the present. See here, books by Scott Appleby from the Koch Center for at Notre Dame. His book, The Ambivalence of the Sacred. Mark Jorgensmeyer on religious nationalism, the rise of religious nationalism in particular. And Regina Schwartz, her book, The Curse of Cain, The Violent Legacy of Monotheism, which points out how we've been operating weirdly in an economy that has been thriving under a model of scarcity. That is, our religious traditions have actually, and our monotheistic traditions in particular, have reinforced what she sees as this model of scarcity. And it seems to me that fear of decline, however you want to describe it, has fed into the kind of quote-unquote populist and autocratic rhetoric and practice here in the country, manifested in people like Steve Bannon in the recent administration, which is very much beholden to the Putin model without apology. Astonishing, right? It's mind-blowing. But it seems to me this idea of the backlash, which is not, of course, my construction. It's Nina Simone's, and then it was picked up by Susan Faludi as well in describing the backlash to the sexual revolution in particular, and the harm done to women and our LGBTQ siblings. So, 4 long trajectories, right, leading us to our present. And I'd be happy to talk about those with you in conversation 2. 2 then points to draw out of this to help characterize the present, and the first is this: escalating violence. Seems to me on the global stage, we face mutually incompatible mimetic rivalries. And this, whoops, what happened? Okay. brief gremlin there. And of course, that language of mimetic rivalries is beholden to René Girard, who I have a deep love-hate relationship with. I mean, I'll never think the same way again, but I'm really critical of some of his sort of overarching triumphalist narratives as well. But it seems to me he's right that when we're stuck in these situations of rivalries in particular, we tend to find scapegoats and be in favor of sacrifices of one kind or another. That diagnosis of the human condition seems to me a profound and illuminating one. And so we're in this mutual mimetic rivalry of democratic globalization, for the lack of a better way to describe it on the one hand, versus religious nationalism on the other, which is characteristic both of terrorism. If you read Robert Pape's works on terrorists, it's all about occupation and the threat, the perception of occupation. He's written a really interesting article on, he's read and seen all of the martyrdom videos produced by terrorists. And the title of the article is, "It's the Occupation Stupid." So the sense that empire is encroaching on their religious freedom and integrity as Muslims by and large. But also, of course, of authoritarian states, which are by and large constructed around religious nationalist dynamics. And what's interesting about this and important to note is that this is not distinct to any one religious tradition. And this is what leads me to believe that we're truly dealing here with global systems at work. Because you have Hindu religious nationalism in India, Modi, right, the BJP. You have Orthodox Christian nationalism in Russia, exploited by Putin, right, to justify his attack on semi-Catholic Ukraine. And there is a clear religious dimension to what's going on there. And you have, evangelical Protestants and Trump religious nationalism in the United States. You have Brazilian sort of Catholic, indigenous, Pentecostal religious nationalism on the part of Bolsonaro in Brazil. So, in any event, it seems to me what we see here, and my hope, is that what we're experiencing is kind of the last gasp of this strongman backlash to democratic globalization. That's a hopeful construction, right? But I also believe it's an accurate one. But let me just sit with the less hopeful one first. This clash portends an apocalyptic future unless common action toward common good can be engaged. On the climate crisis in particular, doom looms unless enemies can be converted or persuaded, not overcome. And here I've been deeply informed by, peace building, peace growing theory, and this little book by Walter Wink, who of course is a biblical scholar, who wrote 3 volumes on the powers, and this is the Reader's Digest condensed version. I mean, it's like 90 pages long. I cite it to my students, they love it. But it will change forever the way you think about nonviolence and how it works, in my experience. So well worth picking it up and reading it. You can read it in an hour and a half or so. It's big font too. But it just distills how nonviolence works in ways that violence can't, doesn't. Right? And yet, violence has escalated in our streets. I think that's probably pandemic response more than ever, because we've seen this in previous pandemics. In the Black Plague, for instance, there was, the biggest rise of anti-Semitism in Europe prior to the Shoah in response to the plague. And so I think when you stoke people's fear, they're likely to lash out, and that's why we see the street crime we see. Of course, everybody's going to blame it on Joe Biden, but we'll just let that one go for now. But that violence is escalating, and at one level seems to me absolutely accurate, and then in systemic ways too, in global economic inequality, another form of violence that is a result of the kleptocratic authoritarian regimes that have imposed autocracies around the globe. So we have to be mindful of that reality, part of the backlash. But point 2 is growing peace. And this is the next book I'm working on. A Coming Religious Peace is the title, which argues that when our religious traditions get our acts together and practice what we preach, which we have been doing better at over the last few decades, I believe. Vatican II is huge in that regard. I think. Still have a long ways to go. But if you begin to study what's happened around the globe and the peace-growing efforts that have begun, from basically Gandhi to this woman here, Lima Bowie, the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize winner for the amazing work that she did in Liberia, you can see this undercurrent of interreligious, and that's a really important note. Interreligious peace-growing since 1914. That points us toward an alternative and hopeful future. And this, by the way, is an extraordinary book. I mean, it's really a beautiful memoir, incredibly honest, searing in its recognition of the fact that she was living in a civil war, she was living in refugee camps, she was a single mom, and stood up in St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Monrovia one Sunday and said, "Women, wake up! We want peace, no more war." That was it. There was a Muslim police sergeant on duty that day, Asatu Kenneth, who heard her spoke and came up to the microphone after and said, "Sister Lima, you will organize the Christian women, I will organize the Muslim women, and we will work for peace." Which they did. Now, Sister Lima was a social worker as well, and had studied peace building at Eastern Mennonite University. So she had some skills that she put into practice in trauma healing and trauma counseling with child soldiers and with the women who've been traumatized by the war. So that gave her credibility, earned her trust in the grassroots. Right? But deeply out of her faith, coming out of her Lutheran spirituality as well. And then the Muslim women, and gathering in the square as the dictator Charles Taylor convoy would go by every morning. They took over this fish market, this square, and they danced, and they sang, and they drummed, and they prayed. And they ended the Civil War. Not on their own. UN had something to do with that too. Ended the Civil War after 14 years. Took over the peace conference that was, took it over in a sit-in that locked the men in the room because they weren't getting anything done. It's an extraordinary story. And one of the men tried to break through, tried to get out, and Sister Lima just went off on this guy and started to strip naked. Because in African indigenous spirituality, it's the person who sees the mother naked who is the offender rather than the naked person, which is very much like Jesus' teaching too. Anyway, read the book. It's extraordinary. But out of that peace conference came a new constitution for Liberia, right? Which eventually led to the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first female president of an African nation, without a weapon other than her words, her witness, her community organizing, nonviolence. All right, so the book I'm working on and builds on this one on Ulan, where I saw in his peace-growing work 5 what I call seeds of peace. Education for literacy across domains, not just the 3 R's, but also literacy in one's tradition and practice, and a capacity to draw on second-order reasoning. Nonviolent practices, it is my conviction that our religious traditions are all part of training our brains for sociability. That is, our religious traditions are the primary way we have developed as human beings to learn to resolve problems without resorting to fight or flight, and instead using truly human resources of language, symbol, myth, story, song, dance, prayer. Engaged empathy speaks for itself, principal pluralism, and then social enterprises. I could say more about each of these, but these are what I call 5 seeds of peace, or 5 practices of peace, 5 ways to cultivate peace in the peace-building, peace-growing garden. I use gardening because I think peace is, by and large, when it happens, an organic process more than it is a construction. Okay. Let me pause there. We have how much longer? 15 minutes?
We have until 1.
Oh, awesome. Good. I didn't talk too long. Then, let me just pause there and see if there are any questions. I have 2 case studies then that I want to share with you and ask you to reflect on, write a little bit about, and then we'll share, and we'll have about 15 minutes for case study, or as long as the conversation goes. But please, any questions about what I presented by way of kind of setting our current post-truth era where the bad guys are winning in context? Yeah, please, and your name again, I'm sorry.
Chris.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, thanks so much. Would you be able to, or I'm sure you'd be able to help unpack principle of pluralism, just a little bit, what you mean by that?
Sure. So, I'm really an advocate of Diana Eck's work and the Pluralism Project at Harvard. With this exception, I think she unfortunately falls a little bit into the relativist school of social constructionism. And I want to hold out for a more robust conception of truth in association with our traditions, in the way that Gandhi did in his Satyagraha, and the way that Fethullah Gulen does in his own teaching as well. I mean, it's very clear he's a Muslim. He's deeply skilled and practiced in Quranic exegesis and in the schools of jurisprudence, and faithful practitioner of the 5 pillars of Islam, and so on and so forth. So what I mean by principle pluralism is that deep commitment and engagement with one's own tradition, which then gives one the freedom to engage robustly without fear with another, right? And truly in a pluralistic understanding of learning from each other through dialogue. The term Gulen uses, and I discuss this in some length in the book, is in Turkish hoşgörü, which is a compound. It usually gets translated as tolerance, right? So the most accessible of Gulen's books in English is Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. So it's his anti-Samuel Huntington book, right? Who posed this clash of civilizations between the Christian, Judeo-Christian secular West and the Muslim West, basically, was the argument of that. And Gulen is saying, no, we can practice this hoşgörü, this tolerance. But it's a bad translation, and of course tolerance in English is a weak term, right? I'll tolerate you all, I'll put up with you, right? What it means is, literally, it's a compound term, to see nicely. And Scott Alexander from Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and I were on a panel together in Ghana, in Accra, Ghana, where we were speaking with indigenous practitioners, Muslims, and Christians. First time those 3 groups had ever been brought together, and it was at the instigation of people inspired by Gulen. Scott talked about this term. His Arabic and Turkish is much better than mine. And he said, really, to understand this term and its significance for Gulen and people of his net, we need to understand it theologically. And so hoşgörü, to see nicely, means to see another as God sees them. And for a Muslim, that means to see others with eyes of mercy and compassion. And that means, Gulen says, to forgive anything that is forgivable and to work with people on anything that is of benefit, that is pleasing to God. So that's principled pluralism. Make sense?
Oh yeah, thank you very much.
Cool. You're welcome. Other questions about those 4 trajectories, or those 2 main points? The escalating violence on the one hand, the emergence of peace growing on the other? No? Clear enough? Cool. All right. To the case studies then. Number 1. And I'm sticking with my musical theme, so forgive me for that. But what's love got to do with it? And you can read it, I'll read it for you, and then the question that I asked you to write on. This is from Willie Jennings' book, After Whiteness.
Our theology department just read that.
Did you?
Last year.
the book put into words so much of what I had experienced in theological education that it truly blew me away, right? And education and belonging. So here's one of the, here's the section I'd like you to reflect on and think about a little bit. My loves, he writes, are clear and out in the open. I love books and ideas and talking about them endlessly deep into the night or early in the morning with cups of coffee and the bright light of a new day are equally pleasurable in the gray skies of a wintry noon. I love theology, all of it. I love African American studies, all of it. I love other fields as well, sociology, anthropology, geography, literary studies, and others. I love the ideas of a number of people, and I love them as much as it is possible to love those who are distant to you in time, space, or the contours of life. But I did not always name my love so openly, because in the academy, affections are feared, because affections have been forced. We live in the wake of a decision to limit loves, directing their flow in only one direction, away from non-white flesh and toward the European. So my question is this, and I'll give you a couple minutes to jot some notes to write a few things while I play for you Nina Simone's Backlash Blues. It's about 2.5 minutes or so. All right. Here's the question. And this, again, I was going to use note cards, but that's apparently an expensive item. Here, easy. What are your loves? And how do they shape your teaching and research? Are they out in the open for students, for the public? Have they been somehow forced? Okay? So who'd like to start? Thank you.
Sure. I love the experience of having my mind blown, perceptions changed, new meaning and truth unlocked. And it's really nice writing with Nina Simone. I feel like I it's like a little bit of a writing groove there. I love finding God in all things, and despite being an introvert, I love working with other people towards a common end.
Lovely. Yeah, thanks. What's your research on?
I do comparative theology, so Christianity alongside other religious traditions, particularly Hindu, spiritual, and mystical.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Others? Have you ever felt your loves were forced? That last part of the question?
I don't think so. Not my loves. I probably had false loves before. Things that I was told to love, but in the end, though, those things, as soon as you get a little bit more confidence in who you are as a person, it's a little easier to let go of those.
True.
What do you mean by false? Pardon me, by forced love?
Well, I think it's Jennings' word. And I think what he's reflecting on is the way, white supremacy has operated in the academy to narrow discourses, to narrow norms and expectations for what constitutes orthodoxy, truth, goodness, beauty, right? I think that's what Jennings, if we could beam him into the room to sit with us, I think that's what he would be talking about. Sort of the Eurocentric Enlightenment paradigm and its sway within academic life. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It's consistent with what I've read about him.
Yeah.
Or by him, I mean.
Is it consistent with your experience of the academy? See you shaking your head.
Well, there are just lots of people in many disciplines that are saying some of these very same things.
Indeed there are.
say sociology, anthropology, geography is just all forced law. I don't get that.
Okay.
I don't know who he's reading in those fields that excludes on racial grounds.
Okay.
I-
Please.
Well, okay, so
Thank you, Dan.
I'm putting on my social psychology hat here.
And your name again is?
Pam.
Hey, Pam.
And so I love thinking about human behavior and the why behind our behavior. I love the insight of the fundamental attribution error and challenging
Say that again?
the insight of the fundamental attribution error, which is that we tend to we try to explain other people's behavior based on their disposition, that people behave in certain ways because of who they are. So bad people do bad things, and good people do good things.
Okay.
And challenging the patriarchy and racist beliefs. Often these loves remain hidden, like the broccoli under the cheese. I have to force myself to stay in my scientific background.
Ah, okay. And you are a sociologist?
As social psychologist.
Social psychology. Wow. Okay, so in that sense, your loves have been in some way excluded from your field, you feel?
Or the fullness of my love has to be expressed in more scientific terms.
Yeah.
And that doesn't capture it all.
Yeah. I mean, to respond to, thank you very much for that, Pam. To go back to Dan's comment, I mean, you know, in my own experience at least, I have discovered over the last few decades, the seminary in Philadelphia is about a third African American students from Koch, Amy, Zion, and so forth. I have learned from them and from the reading I've done in critical race theory. Here's one of those shibboleths for you, right? Speaking of the Backlash. How white my own education at the University of Chicago was. I mean, just profoundly riddled with assumptions of white supremacy, well, not malign or at all intentionally exclusive, in fact were, in profound ways. That's why I said Jennings' book put into words for me an awful lot of what I had experienced as a historian. So, you know, my first book was a study of the debates over freedom of the will in early America from 1630 to 1760. So basically, I sat in front of a microform reader reading a bunch of deadly dull sermons by Puritan and Anglican divines about predestination. I mean, it was as white as you could possibly get when it came to theology, just Calvinist and Anglican and, you know, these European models. And anyway, that was what I thought I had to do, was sort of demonstrate this mastery of this area. And it was so constricting that when I gave a talk about it to a bunch of wealthy donors at the University of Chicago, you know, blue hairs and people like that, you know, they were all just fall asleep, right? And unfortunately, so much of academic life, it seems to me, has fallen into that sort of forced categorization of what counts as authentic and real scholarship, rather than its public significance drawn from the kind of eros, right? That is one of the holy loves. Others are the workshop topic on this case study.
Well, I feel really fortunate because I had a very European education in the sense that I studied at the Catholic University of Louvain.
Oh yeah, beautiful place.
Yeah, and you know, all my professors there, when I say I feel very fortunate, I'm not explaining it completely yet, but well, what I mean is that despite the fact that this was a very Eurocentric environment, and despite the fact that almost all the theologians discussed in class were Europeans.
Waiting to hear how this is going to end.
When there were people there in the early 70s who were, some of the professors were broadening the outlook quite a bit. But in my own study and research, I came upon Jewish authors, and no one had done a doctoral dissertation there on a Jewish thinker. In the philosophy department, people had worked on Levinas.
Sure.
Working on Levinas, and some other Jews in the history of philosophy. But in the School of Theology, to my knowledge, no one had done anything in Arab Judaism. But I received complete and full support, so I feel very fortunate to do that. And so I'm a Catholic theologian who specialized then in the study of Jewish theology and philosophy, and I was supported at every turn. So I guess I was very lucky, you know, and then so one of the things I said that I love when it comes to my professional life, but it's also a part of my personal life, is exploring diverse approaches to God. And here I wrote up a new course called Diverse Approaches to God, been completely supported. And you know, it is an expression of my love. And what were the questions there? Yeah, so I created the course, I write on this subject. So yes, it's in the open, and it's just coming from, you know, my own love. And so I feel really lucky because I know not everybody has had that situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, you and me, conform to, you know, Jennings, white male, European model of what is the norm in the academy, alas. So yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. People love the fact that I was writing on these deadly dull Puritan divines in the 18th century, right? I mean, why?
But see, I mean, I was steeped in Schleiermacher and Barth and the controversy and all that type of thing. But then in graduate research, I would bring in Jewish thinkers that I thought presented a really good alternative to Schleiermacher on the question of religious experience, and a thoroughly opposite approach to Barth. And you know, professors who were steeped in those thinkers did welcome what I was doing and promoted it. So I do feel very lucky in that sense, because they might not have. So I went in an alternative way, in the sense that I was, you know.
Well, our loves weren't forced, I guess would be a way to put it, huh?
Right. Yeah. No. And it was interesting for me because it was, you know, I mean, I was enjoying the reading I was doing, assigned reading that I was doing, like the Schleiermacher, Barth, and then more so in the field of Catholic theology.
Okay, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you, John.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I think
I'm happy to stop.
I think I hear you.
Yeah.
But I'd like to hear from others and their perceptions on this question before we have about 10 minutes left before we turn to the other. Yeah, please, Carol.
My loves, love living and teaching about cross-cultural interactions, cross-cultural leadership, cultural competence development, intercultural knowledge building. And I do feel that, yes, it's out in the open and it does shape my teaching and research. And I said it's maybe not forced, but forged from my personal background and life experiences.
Okay. What research do you do? What cultures do you cross in particular?
Asia. I'm also director of the Asian Studies program. So I do research on Asian and Western management styles.
Important.
But I'm also doing a talk on Sister Thea Bowman in a few weeks. If you'd like to give me some input. Shameless plug.
Where are you doing it? Where are you doing it, Deborah?
It's in 2 weeks at University of Portland.
Oh, cool. It's a city I've never visited. I've always wanted to. I love, one of my favorite crushes musically right now is Esperanza Spalding. And if you want to impress your Portland friends, when you go there, she's got a song called City of Roses. She grew up in Portland. You know, she's this amazing sister who plays the bass and sings. She's one of Barack Obama's favorite artists as well. Esperanza Spalding. Any of you know who she is? She's just a phenomenal bassist and has a beautiful soprano voice to go along with it. And truly, and she went to Berkeley School of Music, so she's multi-talented. She's got the theory to go along with the technical chops. And just really writes great songs. She's got another one called Black Gold, which is about African Americans and African American men in particular. Black Gold. And her harmonies are just, I think you'll enjoy her a lot. And again, it'll earn you, some props with your Portland audience to be able to say, I was listening to Esperanza Spalding on the way in today. Airport. So
You can give that lecture here next year.
making more work for you already. All right. Anybody else on their loves? We got 7 minutes left, and I want to at least share with you the second of the workshop topics. But I'd love to hear what you've written too. I did talk to him.
No, for the first time, this today.
All right. Well, let me just share this one with you, and we can, you don't have to write, you'll just talk about it maybe, but this is from another book that I really love. Where is the clicker? Huh.
Are you able to?
Oh, there it is. There it is. I see it on the screen here, but I don't see it up there. That's really weird. Well, that is odd. Anyway, let me just read it to you, and you can think about it, reflect upon it, etc. And I'll be happy to hang around and have some conversations individually afterwards if you'd like. This is from a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Have you heard of her? Mm-hmm. She's a botanist and a Potawatomi as well. And the title of the book, it's just a beautifully written book, is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. It is truly lyrical prose. It's uneven. It's a collection of essays written over the course of her life, basically, about her work, both as a Potawatomi and as a Ph.D. in botany, a professor of botany. So here's the passage. This is describing her. The caption I've given it musically is "He blinded me with science." Right, and she's describing her freshman year, her registration at the university that she was attending. Even before I arrived at school, I had all of my answers prepared for the freshman intake interview. I wanted to make a good first impression. There were hardly any women in the forestry school in those days, and certainly none who looked like me. The advisor peered at me over his glasses and said, "So, why do you want to major in botany?" His pencil was poised over the registrar's form. How could I answer? How could I tell him that I was born a botanist, that I had shoeboxes of seeds and piles of pressed leaves under my bed, that I'd stopped my bike along the road to identify a new species, that plants colored my dreams, that the plants had chosen me? So I told him the truth. I told him that I chose botany because I wanted to learn about why asters and goldenrod looked so beautiful together. Purple and yellow, by the way, for the Vikings fans in the audience. I'm sure I was smiling then in my red plaid shirt. But he was not. He laid down his pencil as if there was no need to record what I had said. "Miss Wall," he said, fixing me with a disappointed smile, "I must tell you that is not science. That is not at all the sort of thing with which botanists concern themselves." He told me that science was not about beauty, not about the embrace between plants and humans. I didn't think about it at the time, but it was happening all over again, an echo of my grandfather's first day at school, when he was ordered to leave everything, language, culture, family behind. The professor made me doubt where I came from, what I knew, and claimed that his was the right way to think. Only he didn't cut my hair off. And so the question I'll ask you as we depart: have you been on either side of a version of this dialogue in your own field? If so, describe what happened and how it changed you. More broadly, how do you think your field and teaching needs to change, if at all, in light of our post-truth, bad guys winning, present? I'll leave you with that, and thank you for being here. I'm an ardent devotee of the Western linear conception of time, which says that if you contract to be with people from 12 to 1, that's what you do. But as I mentioned, I'd be happy to share this slide deck with any of you who want it. You can find me easily enough online, email, and I'd also be happy to hang around for individual conversations if your time permits. Thank you again for being here, and I hope it was provocative and of interest.